The moment the US and the Soviet Union stopped fighting side by side against Hitler, they started fighting each other everywhere else.
Not with tanks and infantry, but with doctrines, with spies, these incredible technological races, and, of course, these brutal proxy wars fought on borrowed ground.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission today is, well, it's enormous. We're unpacking the state of global geopolitical rivalry we call the Cold War.
We are diving deep into the 44 years and 9 months, from 1947 all the way to 1991. We're going to try and analyze the key phases, the shifting doctrines, the near catastrophes, and maybe most importantly, the enduring economic and political legacy that really shapes the world you live in right now.
Yeah, and it's called cold because you never had that direct, military engagement between the two superpowers.
Right.
But that term cold, it just feels fundamentally misleading when you look at the sheer death toll. I mean, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, dozens of other places.
It was anything but cold for them.
Exactly. The global tension, the constant fear of nuclear annihilation, the espionage, it was hot for the rest of the planet.
And that's the paradox of the Cold War, isn't it? The core mission today is to cut through that complexity, to give you a really thorough understanding of the major turning points and the surprising internal dynamics that actually drove these global events. And we'll do it by focusing only on the most crucial nuggets, respecting your time.
Okay, so before we jump into that post-war rift, let's quickly look at the origins of the name itself. The sources suggest it's actually a fascinating historical footnote.
It really is. What's fascinating is that the general concept, this idea of perpetual non-military tension under the shadow of catastrophe, it actually predates the USSR conflict.
Oh, really?
Yeah, George Orwell, of all people, used the term in a general sense way back in 1945.
Wow.
He was in his essay, You and the Atomic Bomb, and he was just describing a state of mind, a world sort of stuck in permanent existential tension because nuclear weapons now existed.
So the philosophical concept was there first, but applying it to the specific rivalry, that came later.
2 years later, to be exact, Bernard Baruch, who was a very influential Wall Street financier and an advisor to presidents, he first used the term specifically for the USSR confrontation in April 1947.
Okay, so he's the one who said it out loud?
He's the one who said it, but the sources confirm the man who actually wrote that speech was a journalist, a longtime political aide named Herbert Bayard Swope.
Ah, so Swope coined it, Baruch delivered it.
Exactly. And the term gained wide immediate currency, not just from that speech, but when the very prominent newspaper columnist Walter Lippmann published his book, simply titled The Cold War.
And it just stuck.
It stuck because it resonated. It perfectly captured the essence of this massive global struggle fought without conventional armies hitting the central enemy. That ideological definition, as you'll see, was everything.
Okay, so let's get into it. Part 1, the foundation of conflict and containment running from 47 to 53.
To understand the foundation, you really need to realize just how quickly that post-World War II alliance dissolved.
I mean, it was almost immediate.
It really was. They defeated Hitler together, but their goals for post-war Europe were just completely incompatible. The USSR, seeking a buffer zone and security after 2 devastating invasions, just consolidated power. They installed satellite governments in occupied Eastern Europe.
And by 1949, that political division was pretty much set in stone.
It was, stretching from Albania all the way up to North Korea.
And that division was captured so vividly in one of the most famous speeches of the century, Winston Churchill, 1946, his Iron Curtain speech.
Right. He argued that this invisible, unyielding barrier had descended across the continent, separating the democratic West from the Soviet-controlled East. And, this wasn't just rhetoric. It crystallized a geopolitical reality for the West.
And Moscow wasn't being subtle about its ambitions beyond that line either.
Not at all. U.S. anxiety grew exponentially because of 2 primary actions. First, Soviet demands on Turkey. They wanted joint control of the strategic Dardanelles and the Black Sea border. And second, the 1946 Iran crisis, where Stalin delayed withdrawing Soviet forces, which was a clear violation of their agreements.
So these weren't isolated incidents. Washington saw a pattern.
They saw a pattern of Soviet expansionism that needed to be checked.
This rising alarm brings us to George F. Kennan, a diplomat in Moscow who just fundamentally shaped U.S. strategy. Let's unpack this. The famous long telegram of 1946. Why was a single, very long-winded cable so important?
Because it gave Washington the intellectual framework that it was lacking. Kennan argued that Soviet aggression wasn't based on transient factors like Stalin's personality. It was based on deep-seated ideological and historical Russian paranoia.
Okay.
But crucially, he argued the Soviets were cautious and flexible. This meant they would retreat when they were faced with strong resistance.
Ah, so not unstoppable.
Exactly. Therefore, the U.S. should adopt a long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant counterforce strategy. It was designed to contain Russian expansive tendencies. That was the essence of containment.
And this idea was immediately formalized with the Truman Doctrine in 1947. This is the moment the conflict becomes explicitly ideological, isn't it?
It really is. Truman didn't just propose aid. He framed the entire struggle as one between free peoples and totalitarian regimes.
That framing is genius. It's so powerful because it makes the conflict universal and it justifies intervention anywhere on the globe.
It does. And the immediate application was in Greece, where the U.S. intervened to help the government fight communist-led insurgents in its civil war.
What's interesting is the sources suggest Stalin actually told the Greek communists not to fight.
He did, but Truman presented the conflict as this grand ideological battle anyway, which, it garnered overwhelming domestic support for the intervention.
So after the ideological fight, you have the next immediate challenge, economic devastation. Europe was literally starving.
And the U.S. understood that economic desperation was the single greatest recruiting tool for local communist parties.
Enter the massive undertaking of the Marshall Plan in 1948.
The U.S. pledged a staggering $13 billion, that's nearly $190 billion in today's money, to reconstruct Western Europe.
And the goal was twofold, right?
Exactly. Humanitarian aid, yes, but also a firm geopolitical commitment. The U.S. needed to ensure democratic systems survived and, critically, link Western prosperity to German economic recovery and, of course, to U.S. markets.
The success of that whole plan really hinged on Stalin's reaction. So how did Moscow respond to the U.S. trying to essentially buy Western Europe?
He immediately rejected it. He was terrified that economic integration with the West would give the Eastern Bloc nations a path to escape Soviet political control.
So she framed it as what? Imperialism?
He framed the Marshall Plan as U.S. economic imperialism, and therefore he forbade Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the other satellites from accepting any of the aid.
And so the Soviet counter was the Molotov Plan, later formalized as COMCON, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, in 1949.
But that plan was never able to match the scale or the financial depth or the immediate effect of the Marshall Plan. It really cemented the East's economic disadvantage right from the start.
The political maneuvering was so intense, and the West really needed definitive proof that the Soviets were a genuine threat to liberal democracy. They needed to convince a reluctant U.S. Congress to fully fund the Marshall Plan.
And that proof arrived with just chilling clarity in 1948.
The Czechoslovak coup. Czechoslovakia was the last Eastern European democracy that was allowed any measure of freedom by the Soviets.
And the subsequent communist takeover, which involved publicly brutalizing opponents and purging political rivals, it just shocked Western powers. The brutality and the finality of that coup swept away virtually all remaining opposition to the Marshall Plan in the U.S. Congress.
It was a powerful public demonstration.
It was. It showed that negotiation with Stalin meant only capitulation.
That fear quickly led to the solidification of military alliances. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was established in 1949, a historic commitment by the U.S. to the defense of Western Europe.
And the Soviet counter was the Warsaw Pact in 1955. But what's crucial to remember here, and what the sources really emphasize, is that the Warsaw Pact was not a genuine defensive alliance like NATO.
How so?
The Soviets already had complete military domination over their satellites. Its main function was actually political, ensuring Soviet hegemony and providing a legal basis to intervene to crush dissent, as we'll see later on.
Okay, so the first physical flashpoint, the first major test of wills, came right in the heart of Germany, the Berlin blockade, 1948 to 49. Why did Stalin institute a land and water blockade of West Berlin, which was deep inside East German territory?
He was furious. The West was moving to unify their zones of occupation in Germany, and critically, they introduced the new Deutschmark currency. Stalin saw the unified, neutral Germany he had wanted slipping away, replaced by a West German state that was increasingly allied with the U.S.
So he blockaded Berlin to force the West to abandon their zone.
That was the plan.
And here is where logistics become epic, and where the Cold War rivalry starts looking like this massive organizational challenge. The U.S. and Britain launched the colossal Berlin airlift.
It was a logistical marvel. They were supplying an entire exclave, a huge city of millions deep within Soviet territory, flying in coal, food, supplies, often under Soviet harassment.
And the sheer consistency and scale of it.
It broke the Soviet will. It was an overwhelming logistical, political, and psychological success for the West, and it cemented West Berlin's determination to resist communism.
I love that detail from the sources about the U.S. Air Force pilot, Gail Halvorson, who started Operation Vittles. He was dropping tiny parachutes packed with candy for the German children.
It's a perfect example of how the U.S. leveraged soft power right alongside its logistical might. It firmly linked West Berlin's destiny to the United States.
But just as the West was celebrating its success in Berlin, the entire nuclear landscape changed forever.
The USSR detonated its first atomic device in 1949, far, far sooner than the U.S. had anticipated.
And the reason for that speed? Extensive Soviet espionage. Specifically, the atomic spies who had infiltrated the U.S. Manhattan Project.
Exactly. And this realization that the Soviets had achieved nuclear parity much faster than expected was terrifying for U.S. strategic planners.
On the flip side, though, U.S. intelligence was also deeply successful, particularly with signals intelligence. The Venona intercepts provided overwhelming evidence of extensive Soviet spy networks operating inside America. Names, activities, everything.
That knowledge, however, was complex. The Venona project was so secret that its findings were rarely shared, and ironically, the program itself was compromised relatively early on by Soviet double agents like Kim Philby.
So both sides knew they were being watched, and that constant fear of infiltration shaped domestic politics. Hello, McCarthyism for decades.
That new nuclear reality and the communist victory in China in 1949 led to a radical reevaluation of U.S. strategy. Containment, as Kennan originally conceived it, was now seen as insufficient.
And that strategic shift manifested in this secret document, NSC-68, in 1950. The sources show this proposed quadrupling U.S. defense spending and viewing the entire global conflict as a zero-sum battleground.
This is a crucial intellectual difference. Kennan's containment was focused on political patience. NSC-68 transformed containment into an active military policy.
Meaning what, exactly?
It was now interpreted by some, particularly General MacArthur, as implying a complete rollback of Soviet influence globally.
So actively undermining existing communist states, not just preventing new ones from forming.
Precisely.
And that brings us to the first major hot proxy conflict, the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. When North Korea invaded the South in June 1950, U.S.-led UN forces intervened.
Initially, the goal was simple containment: push North Korea back across the 38th parallel.
But the success of the Incheon landing inspired General MacArthur to shift the goal to roll back.
Right. He attempted to overthrow North Korea and unify the peninsula under UN supervision. This aggressive move triggered a massive Chinese intervention.
China, fearful of a U.S. invasion on its own territory, sent this huge volunteer army, driving the UN forces back near the original 38th parallel.
And the war ended in a bloody stalemate in 1953.
So the lesson learned was painful, but definitive.
It was. Rollback, when applied to existing communist states backed by either the USSR or China, risked massive escalation and potentially global war. The result strengthened NATO's military structure and cemented the divided status of both Germany and Korea for generations.
Oh, okay, that takes us into the second phase, part 2, nuclear brinkmanship and global proxy battles from 1953 to 1962.
Right. The end of the Korean War in '53 ushered in a new era defined by new leaders and some truly existential doctrines. In the U.S., you get Dwight D. Eisenhower, who's aiming to reduce the massive defense budget he inherited from Truman.
And in the USSR, Stalin's death in 1953 eventually leads to Nikita Khrushchev consolidating power by the mid-50s.
And Khrushchev starts the process of de-Stalinization, denouncing the worst excesses of Stalin's rule, and he starts advocating for peaceful coexistence.
That phrase, peaceful coexistence, sounds friendly, but it wasn't, was it? What did Khrushchev actually mean by it?
He meant a sustained, long-term ideological struggle that avoided direct nuclear confrontation. In his view, the Soviet system was historically superior, and it would win the global competition peacefully, provided the Soviets had enough time to boost their military capability.
So it was a tactical pause, not an ideological surrender.
Exactly.
Eisenhower's response was a strategy driven by cost efficiency. His Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, implemented the New Look policy, which emphasized reliance on the U.S.'s superior nuclear arsenal. This was the doctrine of massive retaliation.
Right. Massive retaliation threatened an immediate devastating nuclear response, including the systematic destruction of Soviet bloc cities to any aggression, no matter how minor.
It was cost-effective because nuclear weapons were cheaper than a massive standing conventional army, which fulfilled Eisenhower's goal of reducing the defense budget.
It was.
But wasn't this strategy just fundamentally flawed? I mean, if the only option you leave yourself is total nuclear apocalypse, you risk being paralyzed by anything less than an existential threat.
Absolutely. The doctrine lacked all credibility for small-scale incursions. If the Soviets invaded, say, West Berlin with conventional forces, would the U.S. really commit planetary suicide over one city?
Probably not.
And that strategic flaw is precisely why the next administration had to change course.
So when John F. Kennedy took over, he replaced massive retaliation with flexible response. How did this new doctrine address those shortcomings?
Flexible response sought to give the president options other than nuclear war. It emphasized conventional arms, massively expanded special operations forces like the Green Berets, and surprisingly, it drastically increased the nuclear arsenal itself.
So more options at every level.
The goal was to meet aggression with a commensurate level of force, expanding the entire spectrum of conflict options.
While the superpowers were developing these terrifying new strategies, the Soviets were simultaneously facing significant internal dissent within their satellite states. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 is just a brutal example.
The de-Stalinization process had raised expectations for freedom that Khrushchev was simply unwilling to grant. The uprising in Hungary was genuinely anti-communist, and it culminated in the new regime declaring its intention to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact.
And the Soviet reaction was swift and devastating.
The Soviet army invaded, killing thousands and prompting a massive exodus of nearly 200,000 Hungarians who fled to the west.
This was a watershed moment.
It really was. It revealed that the Warsaw Pact was truly a tool of control, not defense. And crucially, it caused these deep ideological fissures across the West. Western communist parties, which had been previously idealistic, were forced to confront the brutal reality of Soviet totalitarianism, and many of them never recovered their moral or political standing.
Simultaneously, the rivalry moved from the ground to the sky. The space race began, but what's often forgotten is that it was first and foremost a military contest.
Specifically, the race to perfect the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, or ICBM.
And that military focus became alarmingly real with the Sputnik crisis in 1957. The Soviet launch of Sputnik 1 proved they had perfected the necessary rocket technology.
Meaning they could now strike the U.S. heartland with an ICBM.
The alarm in the U.S. must have been intense.
It was. The CIA, in its assessment, recognized Sputnik as a stupendous scientific achievement and correctly concluded that the USSR had likely perfected a reliable ICBM. The American reaction wasn't just about science, it was about the immediate collapse of this long-held notion of American strategic immunity.
So the subsequent race was about national prestige landing a man on the moon, but the underlying drivers were military.
Completely.
Yeah.
The U.S. relied on reconnaissance satellites, and the sources reveal a fascinating detail about the Soviet counter. They used their public Salyut crewed space station program in the 70s and 80s to cover up the secret military nature of their Almaz reconnaissance stations.
So everything in space was, in essence, a weapon platform or a surveillance tool.
At its core, yes.
Back on Earth, the most literal symbol of the ideological divide was erected in 1961, the Berlin Wall. We know Khrushchev famously referred to Berlin as the testicles of the West, saying he could squeeze it anytime he wanted to make the West scream. What made the squeeze so necessary in 1961?
Pure economics. By 1961, East Germany was hemorrhaging its most valuable resource, its skilled workforce.
The brain drain.
A massive brain drain. Nearly 20% of its population, young, educated professionals, had migrated west, largely through that easy loophole in Berlin. It was threatening the very survival of the East German state and the Soviet economic model.
So, on August 13th, 1961, East Germany erected the barrier, initially just barbed wire, but it evolved into the concrete wall physically closing that loophole. The brain drain stopped.
But the human cost and the chilling symbol of confinement was monumental.
And that leads us directly to the apex of danger, the moment the Cold War came closest to going hot. Cuba and the Missile Crisis.
It all starts with Castro's 1959 revolution, which installed a communist regime right in the Western Hemisphere.
After Castro publicly embraced communism, the U.S. responded aggressively. First, the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 failed to overthrow him.
Right, and following that humiliation, the Kennedy administration launched this clandestine terrorist campaign known as Operation Mongoose,
aimed at destabilizing and ultimately overthrowing the Cuban government through sabotage and assassination attempts.
And Operation Mongoose is the crucial context for the missile crisis. Khrushchev viewed it as an imminent threat to Cuba and, by extension, to Soviet prestige. His decision to install intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Cuba was a direct defensive response to Mongoose and also to U.S. missile deployments in Turkey, which bordered the USSR.
The resulting crisis in October 1962, when the U.S. discovered the missiles, brought the world to the brink.
It did. Kennedy's response was a naval blockade and an ultimatum. The resolution was reached through these frantic, secret back-channel communications, notably between Robert Kennedy and a Soviet agent named Alexander Fomin.
And the compromise involved a public trade.
A public trade. Khrushchev removed the Soviet missiles, and in exchange, Kennedy publicly pledged the U.S. would never invade Cuba.
But there was a secret component.
The secret component was the removal of obsolete U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The resolution was only achieved by giving both sides an immediate public win while keeping the politically costly concession about the Turkey missiles secret.
And the political fallout for Khrushchev was devastating.
It was. He was internally blamed by the Soviet Politburo for bringing the world so close to war and for the perceived humiliation of publicly backing down. This outcome contributed directly to his ousting in 1964.
Beyond Europe and Cuba, this period is also defined by the struggle for influence in the Third World as decolonization accelerated.
Both the U.S. and the USSR funneled massive aid and armaments into emerging nations to win loyalty and access.
And the U.S. often resorted to covert actions to ensure friendly or at least anti-communist regimes were installed, regardless of their democratic legitimacy. Let's look at that pattern the sources show.
Okay, so in Iran, 1953, the CIA, working with British intelligence, overthrew the elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who had nationalized British oil interests, and installed the pro-Western Shah.
Stabilized the oil flow, but deeply destabilized Iranian politics long-term.
Exactly. Then in Guatemala, 1954, the CIA orchestrated a coup to oust the leftist president, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, after he instituted land reforms that threatened the interests of the U.S.-based United Fruit Company.
And tragically, in the Congo, 1960.
After the country gained independence, the CIA-backed Colonel Mobutu Sese Seko seized power, facilitating the execution of the democratically elected Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba. This consistent pattern of supporting anti-communist dictatorships was a major hallmark of U.S. strategy, often undermining democratic development in the process.
Yet, many of these emerging nations actively rejected this pressure, right? They sought true independence.
They did. The Bandung Conference in 1955 and the formation of the Non-Aligned Movement in 1961 saw dozens of countries formally refusing to choose sides, seeking an independent path free from all this East-West competition.
Okay, let's move into part 3, détente, disillusionment, and renewed tension. This is 1962 to 1985.
As we move into the 60s, the global political and economic landscape shifts dramatically. Western Europe and Japan, rebuilt by U.S. aid, are starting to thrive. Strong economic growth.
Meanwhile, the Eastern Bloc economies are starting to show clear signs of structural stagnation.
Right. The Soviet commitment to permanent military parity was beginning to really strain the system.
The U.S. was also paying a crippling cost, not financially, but in terms of human life and international prestige, because of the Vietnam quagmire.
The war escalated dramatically under Lyndon B. Johnson, deploying hundreds of thousands of ground combat units.
And the USSR's strategy regarding Vietnam was very calculated.
Very. Leonid Brezhnev, who replaced Khrushchev, he increased military aid to North Vietnam, hoping to tie Hanoi closer to Moscow and away from Beijing, but he was highly cautious about direct escalation.
The sources suggest the Soviets provided just enough military assistance to tie up American forces.
Without risking a direct clash with the U.S., that was the key.
The turning point for the U.S. was the Tet Offensive in 1968. Tactically, a military failure for the North Vietnamese, but a massive strategic victory.
It exposed the limits of American power, and it demonstrated that the South Vietnamese government could not survive without a permanent, full-scale U.S. military commitment. This failure accelerated the policy of withdrawal and the adoption of détente.
A French term meaning a relaxation of tensions.
Exactly. But before détente could truly take root, both sides recognized the inherent existential danger of a world with thousands of nuclear weapons. So they moved to stabilize the nuclear threat.
The Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty 1963 was crucial. It restricted all nuclear testing to underground environments.
And this was followed by the Outer Space Treaty, 1967, establishing space for peaceful purposes and prohibiting the placement of nuclear weapons in orbit. These treaties were essential baby steps back from the abyss of total war.
However, 1968 brought another brutal reminder of the limits of Soviet tolerance, the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia.
This involved significant liberalization, increased freedom of the press, attempts at genuine multi-party governance, and a push toward a more consumer-focused economy.
And once again, the Soviets demonstrated that their control over the Eastern Bloc was non-negotiable. On August 20th, 1968, the Soviet army, backed by most of its Warsaw Pact allies, invaded.
This operation ended the liberalization overnight. It triggered a huge wave of emigration, and it cemented the Brezhnev Doctrine.
And that doctrine, though it was never formally written as such, became the accepted standard.
Right. The USSR claimed the right to intervene militarily in any Warsaw Pact country where communism was threatened. It meant sovereignty was conditional, and it was a public relations disaster, drawing intense criticism even from other communist nations like Yugoslavia and Romania.
This internal communist friction is vital because it sets the stage for one of the most consequential strategic shifts of the Cold War, the Sino-Soviet split.
Tensions between Mao's China and Khrushchev's USSR had been building since the mid-50s. Mao viewed Khrushchev's de-Stalinization and peaceful coexistence as ideological heresy. He saw him as a revisionist straying from true communist revolutionary principles.
And the rivalry was so bitter that it peaked in 1969.
With Moscow actually planning a large-scale nuclear strike against Chinese strategic assets.
And here's where U.S. strategic thinking truly paid off. President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger saw this massive ideological conflict as an unprecedented opportunity to shift the global balance of power.
The goal: use China to pressure the Soviet Union.
That path of rapprochement culminated in Nixon's famous 1972 visit to China.
By playing the China card, the U.S. drastically isolated the Soviet Union, forcing Moscow to become more conciliatory in arms control negotiations to avoid facing a unified U.S.-China front.
This dramatic diplomatic flip established the framework for the détente era running from 69 to 79.
It was defined by pragmatic cooperation between Brezhnev and Nixon-Kissinger, primarily aiming to limit the hugely expensive development of new strategic weapon systems.
The major achievement being the SALT treaties, strategic arms limitation talks.
Landmark agreements limiting anti-ballistic missile systems and setting ceilings on the number of nuclear weapons both sides could possess.
This era was underpinned by Kissinger's philosophy of realism,
which essentially said that in a nuclear world, prioritizing stability and managing the relationship with adversaries was more important than ideological purity or democracy promotion. Conflict management trumped crusading.
But that philosophical basis was challenged later. Détente also produced the Helsinki Accords, 1975, where the Soviets agreed to human rights guarantees and the concept of free elections.
A diplomatic win on paper, but the gap between promise and reality was vast. Human rights activists in the East, like Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Andrei Sakharov, were persecuted relentlessly, demonstrating the limits of Soviet openness.
And when Jimmy Carter took office, he shifted the focus, advocating a foreign policy based on moralism, specifically prioritizing human rights globally.
Which often put him directly at odds with the Soviets, who viewed any U.S. criticism of their internal human rights record as a direct violation of their sovereignty.
Economically, the mid-70s brought further complexities. The 1973 oil crisis, triggered by OPEC cutting production, crippled Western economies.
Ironically, this crisis provided the Soviet Union with a critical, albeit temporary, lifeline.
How?
As global oil prices spiked, the Soviet Union, a major oil producer, generated this huge, unexpected flow of hard currency from energy sales. This influx of cash allowed the deeply inefficient Soviet command economy to mask its systemic failures for a few more years, keeping the state afloat even as its industrial output stagnated.
But the U.S. didn't allow that economic advantage to go unchecked. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment 1974 was a political counterpunch.
This piece of legislation linked granting the USSR most favored nation trade status directly to the emigration rights of persecuted Soviet Jews, known as refuseniks.
So if Moscow didn't allow immigration, commerce was restricted.
It was a direct, successful use of U.S. economic leverage to promote a specific human rights goal, restricting the Soviets' access to American technology and markets.
However, by the late 1970s, détente had essentially collapsed. The toppling of U.S. allied governments in Iran and Nicaragua in 1979, combined with the failure to ratify SALT II, raised tensions sky high.
And the final nail in the coffin was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979. The USSR intervened directly to support the communist PDPA government against the Mujahideen guerrillas,
who were armed and funded by the U.S., China, and Pakistan.
Exactly. This intervention was quickly and accurately dubbed the Soviets' Vietnam. It was a costly, drawn-out counterinsurgency that coincided with severe internal decay in the Soviet system. They were bogged down in a foreign land, pouring resources into a losing conflict.
Carter's response was definitive and multifaceted.
He withdrew the SALT II treaty from Senate ratification, imposed stiff embargoes on American grain and technology exports to the USSR, increased U.S. military spending, and ordered a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics.
Détente was officially dead.
And the world entered a period of renewed confrontation.
Which brings us to part 4, the final push and the collapse from 1979 to 1991. The era spanning 79 to 85 is known as the Second Cold War.
It's characterized by heightened militancy and tension, and Ronald Reagan's election in 1980 marked a decisive shift in U.S. posture.
Reagan and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher were ideological partners.
United in their conviction that the USSR was not just an adversary to be managed, but an evil that needed to be defeated. Reagan famously labeled the USSR the evil empire and laid out a remarkably simple, devastating strategy. We win and they lose.
This aggressive stance translated into policy with the Reagan Doctrine in 1985. This went far beyond the old policy of containment.
Oh, yeah. It advocated the explicit right to subvert existing communist governments and provide overt and covert aid to anti-communist paramilitary groups. This was a doctrine of active rollback.
The U.S. massively increased military spending, funneling aid to groups like the Contras in Nicaragua and the Mujahideen in Afghanistan.
The CIA even actively sought ways to undermine the Soviet Union internally, including promoting Islamism in the Central Asian Soviet republics to stir up internal unrest.
This massive external military and ideological pressure created the crucial military economic squeeze that ultimately broke the Soviet system.
Let's delve into the mechanics of that squeeze, because it's key. The Soviet military machine was consuming a staggering amount, as much as 25% of its gross national product.
At the expense of everything else.
At the expense of investment in consumer goods, infrastructure, civilian technology, this unsustainable burden drove economic stagnation throughout the late Brezhnev years.
And while the Soviet military maintained this huge quantitative advantage, more tanks, more personnel, the sources highlight a massive qualitative inferiority that was masked by sheer numbers.
Take the comparison of main battle tanks. The sources reveal that during Desert Storm, the Soviet T-72 tank was shown to be drastically inferior in armor, fire control, and firing range compared to the American M1 Abrams.
Yet the USSR fielded nearly 3 times as many T-72s as the US fielded M1s. The scale was disguising technological obsolescence.
And Reagan's aggressive military buildup, the largest peacetime defense buildup in U.S. history, just accelerated this pressure, forcing the Soviets to spend money they simply didn't have to keep up.
The most expensive psychological weapon of this era had to be the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, or Star Wars.
Right. This program proposed building a vast system of lasers and satellites to shoot down incoming nuclear missiles in mid-flight.
SDI was never fully operational, but its mere existence was devastating. Why was that?
It wasn't just the technological challenge, it was the economic one. SDI forced the Soviet leadership to consider investing in a completely new, vastly expensive generation of strategic weapons to overcome the shield, potentially doubling or tripling their already crippling defense budget.
And the Soviet system could not bear the weight of that potential future spending.
It couldn't. Adding to this domestic strain was a lethal external economic shock, the 1980s oil glut.
Increased Saudi and non-OPEC production caused oil prices to collapse globally.
And since oil was the Soviet Union's main source of hard currency revenue, the currency they needed to buy Western technology and grain, the price collapse dealt a fatal blow to their already stagnant command economy.
This period of hypertension produced some truly harrowing moments, particularly in 1983, a year that saw 3 major events that brought the world closer to nuclear war than any time since Cuba.
First, on September 1st, Soviet forces shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian Boeing 747 carrying 269 people, after mistaking it for an intruding U.S. spy plane.
Reagan immediately characterized the action as a brutal massacre, increasing global tensions to a fever pitch.
Just weeks later, on September 26, the world was saved by the quick thinking of a single man. A Soviet nuclear false alarm occurred when system glitches at the Superpower 15 command center indicated several U.S. ICBMs were heading toward Russia.
And the duty officer, Stanislav Petrov, correctly suspected the system malfunction.
He did. A single satellite reporting an anomaly, which would be unlikely in a true first strike. He refused to relay the warning up the chain of command and became rightly known as the man who saved the world.
And then in November 1983, the Able Archer 83 NATO exercise. This was a highly realistic simulation of a coordinated NATO nuclear release.
which the Soviet leadership genuinely feared was a cover for an imminent, real nuclear attack. The level of mistrust between East and West was so absolute that a routine exercise was nearly misinterpreted as the beginning of World War III.
This terrifying height of tension finally began to subside with the arrival of Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985.
Facing absolute economic stagnation and the fatal oil price collapse, Gorbachev realized the Soviet state could not sustain its military commitments, and he sought measures to revive the system.
His reforms were the key to the final collapse. He introduced perestroika, restructuring, aiming to refocus resources away from the military toward the civilian sector, allowing limited small businesses and decentralizing some economic decisions.
The idea was to stimulate the moribund economy.
And simultaneously, he introduced glasnost, openness.
This was initially intended to reduce corruption and moderate abuses of power by allowing more transparency, but it immediately enabled increased freedom of the press and unprecedented contact with the West.
So it was an intended lever for efficiency that became a fatal catalyst.
It accelerated the political collapse by allowing decades of suppressed dissent and historical truth to just bubble to the surface.
The thaw in relations rapidly picked up pace. Reagan and Gorbachev began high-stakes talks, resulting in the INF Treaty in 1987.
A major arms control breakthrough that eliminated an entire class of intermediate-range nuclear missiles.
Then, in 1988, Gorbachev announced the game-changing decision, the end of Soviet intervention in satellite states.
This was the moment the Brezhnev Doctrine was explicitly revoked. He was essentially granting Eastern Europe the freedom to choose its own destiny.
And that non-intervention pledge was immediately tested. The Pan-European picnic in August 1989 on the Hungarian-Austrian border acted as a trial run.
When Hungary opened its border and the Soviets did nothing, it triggered a massive, peaceful exodus of East Germans seeking refuge in the West. It set off a chain reaction across the entire bloc.
This led directly to the revolutions of 1989. Peaceful overthrows of communist regimes swept across Central and Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia with the Velvet Revolution, Bulgaria.
The only violent exception was Romania, where the communist dictator Nicolae Ceausescu was executed.
And the iconic moment, the ultimate symbol of the conflict's end, was the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989.
By December 1989, Gorbachev and U.S. President George H.W. Bush formally declared the Cold War over at the Malta Summit.
The dissolution of the Soviet Union itself followed rapidly. Soviet republics began declaring sovereignty and holding free elections, notably Lithuania in 1990.
Hardliners attempted one desperate measure.
The failed August coup in 1991. Hardliners in the KGB and the government attempted to overthrow Gorbachev and reverse the reforms.
The coup failed spectacularly. It fatally weakened Gorbachev, and it catapulted Boris Yeltsin, the newly elected president of Russia, into a position of ultimate authority.
And just 4 months later, on December 25, 1991, the USSR officially dissolved.
15 new independent states emerged. The Russian Federation assumed the Soviet Union's key assets, its UN Security Council seat, its nuclear arsenal, and its financial obligations. The Cold War was finally finished.
So, we have covered 4 decades of intense rivalry. Let's synthesize the core drivers and the reasons for the outcome.
Okay. The core drivers were ideological competition, capitalism versus communism, and the existential ever-present threat of nuclear weapons. But the ultimate cause of the Soviet collapse was internal.
It was economic.
It was. The Soviet command economy's fundamental inability to innovate or sustain the massive military costs required by the rivalry, accelerated critically by that 1980s oil price collapse. They were defeated by economics, not military force alone.
And the immediate aftermath was profound. The U.S. was left as the sole global superpower, shifting the world from bipolarity to a unipolar structure.
The financial cost was staggering. U.S. military expenditures during the Cold War amounted to an estimated $8 trillion. And heartbreakingly, millions of people died in proxy wars across Asia, Africa, and Latin America.
The geopolitical hangover was felt immediately, particularly in regions that had been previously stabilized by U.S.-USSR pressure, most notably the Balkan conflicts.
Right. The end of that overarching stabilizing force of the superpowers contributed directly to the violent collapse of Yugoslavia and the subsequent ethnic conflicts in the 1990s.
This required NATO to fundamentally redefine its role. It transitioned from a pure deterrence alliance focused on defending Western Europe against the Soviet bloc
to an active peacekeeping and intervention force, as demonstrated during the Kosovo conflict in 1999.
Furthermore, the collapse of communism cleared the way for a new global economic paradigm. Neoliberal capitalism became the dominant global system.
This meant deregulation, privatization, and an emphasis on free markets worldwide. And scholars widely posit that this shift, removing the major ideological competitor to liberal capitalism, contributed to the rising global economic inequality we see today as the system faced less political challenge.
That brings us to the thorny, complex issue that defines the geopolitical legacy today: decommunization. This was the attempt to cleanse post-Soviet and post-Eastern Bloc societies of communist structures, names, and the memory of the past.
And the outcome has been far from straightforward. The historian Stephen Holmes argued as early as 1996 that decommunization generally ended in near-universal failure across much of the former Eastern Bloc.
Why?
Because after decades of rule, the communist elite was so deeply entrenched and so many citizens were forced to cooperate with the regime that comprehensive punitive justice became politically impossible. The immediate urgency of economic reform also quickly overtook the desire to prosecute historical crimes.
So the sheer desire for normalcy overcame the desire for punitive justice. It was just too difficult and too destabilizing to fully dislodge the entrenched former communist elites,
Who often smoothly transitioned into new political and economic structures.
You see a stark contrast in this legacy today if you look at the approach in Russia versus Ukraine.
In Russia, the process has been half measures, fostering a rising sense of Soviet nostalgia. Cities retain communist-era names like Ulyanovsk, and the state anthem uses the exact same music as the Soviet Union's anthem, just with new lyrics. The Russian Foreign Ministry has openly called the banning of communist symbols in other countries sacrilege.
But then you look at Ukraine, particularly following the 2014 Revolution of Dignity. Decommunization there is mandatory and comprehensive.
It is. The government outlawed all communist symbols, removed over 1,300 Lenin monuments and 1,000 other monuments to communist figures, and renamed tens of thousands of streets in nearly 1,000 cities and villages. It's an absolute, mandatory cultural and political rejection of the Soviet past.
The political and cultural split over how to handle the past couldn't be clearer.
And the difference between Russia's embrace of a shared Soviet history and Ukraine's absolute rejection of it shapes their current geopolitical conflict.
Which brings us to the final lingering question we're left with, a question that connects the history of the Cold War directly to today's headlines.
It's the inherent tension between accountability and stability. When we look at these contrasting paths of decommunization, we have to ask, when does focusing on the necessary accountability and memory of historical crimes actually begin to hinder the political and economic stability required for a secure future?
And conversely, how might the radically different approaches to memory, Russia looking backward, Ukraine looking forward, continue to shape their geopolitical trajectories in the decades to come?
It's a conflict between memory and modernity that the world is still grappling with.
A truly enduring question from a conflict that supposedly ended over 3 decades ago. Thank you for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.